In the grand halls of Aldermere Palace, where centuries of tradition echo through marble corridors, some secrets are buried so deep that even the walls seem to whisper warnings. For 43 years, Crown Prince Alexander had lived his life according to the rigid protocols of the Aldermere royal family, believing he understood his destiny, his bloodline, and his place in history. But what happens when everything you've been told about your identity crumbles in a single, earth-shattering moment? This is the story of a prince who discovered that the crown he was born to wear was built on a lie so profound it would shake the very foundations of a thousand-year-old monarchy. It's about the moment when duty collides with truth, when family loyalty faces devastating betrayal, and when a man must choose between preserving a kingdom's stability or exposing the secret that could destroy everything he's ever known. Some truths are worth more than crowns. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep. And sometimes, the person you trust most is the one who has been lying to you your entire life. The revelation that would change Prince Alexander's life forever was hidden in plain sight, waiting in a place where no one thought to look, until a dying confession forced him to confront a reality so shocking that it would make him question not just his right to rule, but his very identity as a member of the royal bloodline. What you're about to discover is how one letter, 30 years old and yellowed with age, brought the mighty Aldermere dynasty to its knees and forced a prince to make an impossible choice that would either save his kingdom or destroy it forever. The rain hammered against the ancient windows of Aldermere Palace with such force that Prince Alexander could barely hear his own thoughts. It was the kind of storm that seemed to mirror the turmoil brewing within the palace walls, where whispers of scandal and succession had been growing louder with each passing day. At 43, Alexander had grown accustomed to the weight of expectation that came with being the crown prince of Aldermere, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to discover in the dusty confines of his late grandmother's private study. Queen Mother Margaret had passed away just 3 weeks ago, taking with her decades of royal secrets and family mysteries. Alexander had been tasked with the solemn duty of sorting through her personal belongings, a responsibility that felt both intimate and overwhelming. The Queen Mother had always been a formidable woman, sharp-witted and fiercely protective of the royal family's reputation. Even in death, her presence seemed to linger in every corner of the oak-paneled room where she had spent countless hours writing her memoirs and maintaining her extensive correspondence. Alexander moved methodically through the room, carefully cataloging items that would need to be preserved for the royal archives and others that could be donated or disposed of. The process was proving more emotional than he had anticipated. Every photograph, every piece of jewelry, every handwritten note seemed to carry with it a fragment of his grandmother's indomitable spirit. She had been more than just a queen to him. She had been his confidant, his advisor, and, in many ways, the anchor that kept him grounded when the pressures of royal life became overwhelming. As he worked his way through the massive mahogany desk that dominated one corner of the study, Alexander discovered a small, brass key tucked beneath a stack of old Christmas cards. The key was unlike any he had seen before in the palace, ornate and heavy, with intricate engravings that suggested it was meant for something important. He turned it over in his palm, studying the craftsmanship and wondering what door or box it might open. His grandmother had always been meticulous about security, often joking that she kept more secrets than the National Intelligence Service. The mystery of the key gnawed at him as he continued his work throughout the afternoon. By evening, after the servants had retired and the palace had settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, Alexander found himself drawn back to the study. There had to be something he was missing, some hidden compartment or secret drawer that the key was meant to unlock. He had grown up hearing stories about hidden passages and secret rooms in Aldermere Palace, tales that his grandmother had always dismissed with a knowing smile that suggested there was more truth to them than she was willing to admit. Alexander began his search systematically, running his hands along the walls, checking behind paintings, and examining every piece of furniture for hidden mechanisms. The old palace was full of architectural quirks and features that had been added over centuries of renovations and expansions. What seemed like solid walls could conceal doorways, and what appeared to be decorative molding might hide switches or levers that operated secret mechanisms. It was nearly midnight when he finally found what he was looking for. Behind a portrait of his great-great-grandfather, King Edmund the Bold, Alexander discovered a small panel that moved when pressure was applied to a specific corner of the frame. The panel slid aside to reveal a narrow keyhole, perfectly sized for the brass key he had found earlier. His heart raced as he inserted the key and turned it, hearing the satisfying click of an old lock mechanism engaging. The hidden compartment that opened was larger than Alexander had expected, containing what appeared to be a collection of documents, photographs, and personal items that his grandmother had kept separate from her other belongings. The air that escaped from the compartment carried the musty scent of old paper and secrets long preserved. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he reached inside and withdrew the contents, carrying them to the desk where he could examine them under the warm glow of the antique reading lamp. The first items he examined were photographs, black and white images from what appeared to be the 1960s and 1970s. Many of them showed his grandmother as a younger woman, but there were others that he didn't immediately recognize. There were pictures of a man he had never seen before, someone who appeared to be close to his grandmother based on the intimate nature of some of the shots. In several photographs, the man was holding a baby, and there was something about his smile and the way he looked at the camera that struck Alexander as oddly familiar. Beneath the photographs, Alexander found a bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was elegant and flowing, clearly from someone with excellent penmanship. The letters were addressed to his grandmother, but they were signed with a name that Alexander didn't recognize, James Whitmore. The return addresses indicated that the letters had been sent from various locations across Europe over a period of several years in the late 1960s and early 1970s. As Alexander untied the ribbon and began to read the first letter, he felt a chill run down his spine. The tone was intimate and affectionate, clearly from someone who had shared a deep and meaningful relationship with his grandmother. But it wasn't just the romantic nature of the correspondence that unsettled him. It was the dates on the letters and their timing in relation to his own birth. James Whitmore had been writing to his grandmother during the exact period when she would have been caring for Alexander as an infant, following what the official family history recorded as the tragic death of his parents in an automobile accident. The letters painted a picture of a secret relationship that had somehow been hidden from the royal family and the public for decades. James Whitmore wrote about meetings in remote locations, coded messages passed through trusted intermediaries, and a love that had to remain hidden due to circumstances that he referred to only obliquely in his correspondence. But it was the letter dated just 3 months after Alexander's official birth date that made his blood run cold. In that letter, James Whitmore wrote about the difficulty of watching his son grow up from a distance, unable to claim him or acknowledge their relationship. He spoke about the sacrifice that both he and Queen Mother Margaret were making for the good of the kingdom, ensuring that the royal bloodline would continue even though it meant living a lie that grew heavier with each passing year. The letter was filled with references to our boy and expressions of hope that someday, when the circumstances were right, the truth could be revealed. Alexander read the letter 3 times before the full implications began to sink in. According to these documents, his entire life had been built on a carefully constructed fiction. The parents he had mourned, the tragic accident that had shaped his childhood, the noble sacrifice that his grandmother had made in raising him. All of it was apparently a cover story designed to hide the fact that he was the illegitimate son of Queen Mother Margaret and a man named James Whitmore. The discovery left Alexander feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his identity, his family, and his right to inherit the throne was suddenly called into question. He was not the orphaned prince raised by his loving grandmother. He was the secret son of a relationship that had been deemed too scandalous for the royal family to acknowledge. The implications were staggering, not just for him personally, but for the entire monarchy. As Alexander continued to examine the contents of the hidden compartment, he found additional documents that seemed to support the shocking revelation in James Whitmore's letters. There was a birth certificate that listed different parents than the ones on his official royal documentation, medical records that showed his grandmother had given birth to a son in 1981, and what appeared to be legal documents establishing a trust fund in the name of James Alexander Whitmore. The most damning piece of evidence was a handwritten confession from his grandmother herself, apparently written years later as a kind of insurance policy or perhaps as a way of easing her conscience. In her own words, Queen Mother Margaret admitted to the elaborate deception that had been necessary to ensure the continuation of the royal line. She wrote about the pressure she had felt to produce an heir after the sudden death of the king's only legitimate son, and how her relationship with James Whitmore had provided an unexpected solution to a crisis that threatened the very survival of the monarchy. According to her confession, the official story of Alexander's tragic orphaning had been carefully orchestrated with the help of trusted palace officials and government authorities. False documents had been created, witnesses had been sworn to secrecy, and an entirely fictional family history had been constructed to explain his presence in the royal household. The elaborate nature of the deception spoke to just how high the stakes had been and how many people had been willing to participate in the lie to protect the crown. The weight of this discovery pressed down on Alexander like a physical force. He sat in the dim light of his grandmother's study, surrounded by the evidence of a deception that had defined his entire existence, and tried to process the magnitude of what he had learned. The man he had believed himself to be, the rightful heir to the throne of Aldermere, was revealed to be a carefully constructed fiction. The question that now loomed before him was what he would do with this knowledge, and how it would change not only his own life, but the future of the kingdom he had been raised to rule. As the storm continued to rage outside the palace walls, Alexander realized that he was facing his own tempest, one that threatened to tear apart everything he had ever believed about himself and his destiny. The secret that his grandmother had guarded so carefully for more than 4 decades was now his burden to bear, and the choices he made in the coming days would determine the fate of the Aldermere monarchy for generations to come. The sleepless hours that followed Alexander's discovery passed like a waking nightmare. He found himself pacing the corridors of Aldermere Palace in the pre-dawn darkness, his mind racing with questions that seemed to multiply with each step he took. The weight of the revelation pressed against his chest like a physical burden, making it difficult to breathe normally as he struggled to comprehend the full scope of the deception that had shaped his entire existence. When morning finally came, Alexander knew he couldn't proceed without verification. The documents he had found could be forgeries, the letters could be the product of someone's elaborate fantasy, and even his grandmother's confession could have been written under duress or during a period of mental confusion. He needed to find James Whitmore, assuming the man was still alive, and confirm the truth of what these papers suggested. The very foundation of his identity hung in the balance, and he owed it to himself, to his family, and to the kingdom to uncover the complete truth. Alexander's first challenge was conducting his investigation without alerting the palace staff, the royal security detail, or the government officials who monitored his activities. As crown prince, his movements were carefully tracked, and his communications were often subject to scrutiny in the name of national security. He would need to be clever and discreet if he hoped to pursue this matter without triggering questions that he wasn't yet prepared to answer. Using the private computer in his personal quarters, Alexander began his search for information about James Whitmore. The name was common enough that initial searches yielded hundreds of results, but when he combined it with dates and locations from the letters, a clearer picture began to emerge. James Whitmore appeared to have been a diplomat in the 1970s and 1980s, working for the Foreign Office in various European capitals. This would explain both his extensive travel and his access to the kinds of social circles where he might have encountered the royal family. The more Alexander researched, the more credible the story became. James Whitmore had indeed been stationed in Brussels during the period when the letters indicated he was conducting his affair with Queen Mother Margaret. He had later been transferred to Vienna, then to Madrid, always in positions that would have required significant security clearances and absolute discretion. His career trajectory suggested someone who was trusted with sensitive information and who understood the importance of maintaining confidentiality. After several hours of careful research, Alexander discovered that James Whitmore was indeed still alive. Now in his 70s, he was living in a small village in the Cotswolds, apparently enjoying a quiet retirement after a distinguished career in diplomatic service. The irony wasn't lost on Alexander that his potential biological father was living less than 100 miles from Aldermere Palace, close enough to observe his son's public life, but far enough away to maintain the secret that had defined both their existences. Alexander knew he couldn't simply appear at James Whitmore's door without preparation. He needed to approach this delicately, with a plan that would allow him to gauge the man's reaction and assess the credibility of his story before revealing his own identity. After considerable thought, Alexander decided to pose as a researcher working on a historical project about diplomatic relationships between Britain and the European Union during the Cold War period. This would give him a legitimate reason to contact James Whitmore and request an interview. The phone call was perhaps the most difficult Alexander had ever made. His hands shook as he dialed the number he had found through directory assistance, and his voice nearly failed him when an elderly man answered with a crisp, "Whitmore residence." Alexander introduced himself using a false name, explained his supposed research project, and was surprised when James readily agreed to meet with him. There was something in the older man's voice, a warmth and intelligence that reminded Alexander of his own speech patterns, that made the possibility of their relationship seem even more real. 3 days later, Alexander found himself driving through the rolling hills of the Cotswolds in an unmarked vehicle borrowed from the Palace Motor Pool. He had told his security detail that he needed a day to handle personal business, a common enough occurrence that hadn't raised any suspicions. The village of Little Hampstead was exactly the kind of place where a retired diplomat might choose to spend his golden years, quiet, picturesque, and far removed from the political intrigues of London. James Whitmore's cottage was a charming stone structure covered in climbing roses, with a well-tended garden that spoke to the care and attention of someone who took pride in creating beauty in small spaces. Alexander parked on the narrow lane and sat for several minutes, trying to calm his nerves and prepare himself for what might be the most important conversation of his life. Everything he thought he knew about himself hung in the balance of the next few hours. The man who answered the door was unmistakably the same person from the photographs Alexander had found in his grandmother's hidden compartment, though time had added lines to his face and silver to his hair. James Whitmore stood with the straight posture of someone who had spent decades in formal diplomatic settings, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man who was accustomed to reading between the lines of conversation. Most unsettling of all, when he smiled and invited Alexander inside, there was something about his expression that was hauntingly familiar. The interior of the cottage reflected a life well lived and thoughtfully curated. The walls were lined with books on history and international relations, interspersed with photographs from James's diplomatic career and what appeared to be a collection of art acquired during his travels. Alexander found himself studying every detail, looking for clues about the man who might be his father while trying to maintain the pretense of casual academic interest. James proved to be an excellent host, offering tea and homemade biscuits while settling into a comfortable armchair across from Alexander in the cottage's cozy sitting room. For the first hour, their conversation focused on James's diplomatic career and his observations about European politics during the Cold War period. Alexander found himself genuinely impressed by the man's intellect and insight, as well as his ability to discuss complex international relationships with both nuance and clarity. It wasn't until Alexander began asking more personal questions about James's time in Brussels that the older man's demeanor began to change. There was a subtle shift in his posture, a careful measuring of his words, and what appeared to be a growing recognition that this was no ordinary academic interview. When Alexander mentioned that his research included the social aspects of diplomatic life and the relationships that diplomats formed during their assignments, James's eyes narrowed slightly, and he set down his teacup with deliberate precision. The moment of truth came when Alexander showed James one of the photographs from his grandmother's collection, claiming that it had been found in some diplomatic archives, and asking if James could identify any of the people in the image. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from James's face, his hands began to tremble, and for several long moments he simply stared at the photograph without speaking. When James finally looked up from the photograph, his eyes met Alexander's with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through the elaborate deception that had brought them together. In a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You know who you are, don't you?" It wasn't a question so much as a statement of recognition, the acknowledgement of a truth that both men had been dancing around since Alexander's arrival. The pretense crumbled in that instant. Alexander nodded slowly, unable to speak as emotions he hadn't expected overwhelmed him. James rose from his chair and moved to the mantelpiece, where he retrieved a small wooden box that had been sitting among the cottage's decorative objects. Inside the box were more photographs, including several that showed a baby who was unmistakably a young Alexander, as well as what appeared to be copies of some of the same documents that Alexander had found in his grandmother's secret compartment. James returned to his seat and looked directly at Alexander as he began to tell his version of the story. His voice carried the weight of decades of enforced silence as he described his relationship with Queen Mother Margaret, the impossible circumstances that had led to Alexander's birth, and the agonizing decision to allow the future prince to be raised without knowledge of his true parentage. The love in James's voice when he spoke about both Margaret and Alexander was unmistakable, as was the pain of a man who had been forced to watch his son's life from a distance. According to James, the decision to create the cover story about Alexander's orphan status had not been made lightly. The royal family had been facing a genuine crisis of succession, with the unexpected death of the king's only legitimate heir leaving the monarchy vulnerable to questions about its future. Margaret's relationship with James had begun as a genuine romance, but when she became pregnant, the implications for the crown had forced them to make an impossible choice. James explained that he had been approached by representatives of the royal household and the government, who had made it clear that acknowledging his paternity would create a constitutional crisis that could threaten the stability of the monarchy. In exchange for his silence and his agreement to step away from any claim on his son, he had been guaranteed that Alexander would be raised with all the privileges and responsibilities of legitimate royalty, prepared to rule as if his bloodline were unquestionable. The sacrifice had been enormous for both James and Margaret. They had been forced to end their relationship publicly while maintaining a carefully concealed correspondence that allowed them to share news about Alexander's development and achievements. James had followed every milestone of his son's life through newspaper accounts and official royal photographs, proud of the man Alexander had become but never able to claim him or offer the guidance that a father longed to provide. As James spoke, Alexander found himself studying the man's face, looking for similarities that had been hidden by the fiction of his supposed origins. The shape of James's eyes, the line of his jaw, the way he gestured when making a point, all of these seemed familiar in a way that went beyond their brief acquaintance. It was like looking at a reflection of himself aged by 30 years and shaped by different experiences. The conversation continued deep into the evening, with both men sharing their perspectives on a secret that had defined their lives in profoundly different ways. James spoke about the regret he felt for missing Alexander's childhood, while Alexander struggled to process the complex emotions of meeting the father he had never known existed. There was grief for the relationship they had been denied, anger at the deception that had been necessary, and a strange sense of completion as pieces of Alexander's identity that had never quite fit suddenly fell into place. By the time Alexander prepared to leave Little Hampstead, both men understood that their lives had been irrevocably changed by this meeting. The secret that had been carefully guarded for more than 4 decades was now shared between them, creating a bond that transcended the formal relationships that had defined Alexander's interactions with father figures throughout his life. But with this knowledge came new burdens and impossible choices about what they would do with the truth they now shared. As Alexander drove back toward Aldermere Palace through the darkness, he knew that his investigation had only just begun. Meeting James Whitmore had confirmed the essential truth of the documents he had discovered, but it had also raised new questions about the scope of the deception and the number of people who had been involved in maintaining it. The monarchy that he had been raised to inherit was built on a foundation that was far more fragile than anyone outside the inner circle realized, and the choices he made in the coming days would determine whether that foundation could withstand the revelation of its deepest secret. The revelation of his true parentage left Alexander in an impossible position, torn between the duty he had been raised to fulfill and the truth that threatened to destroy everything he had believed about himself. The drive back to Aldermere Palace had given him time to think, but instead of clarity, he found only more questions and a growing sense of isolation. He was now keeper of a secret so explosive that it could topple the monarchy, yet he had no one he could trust with the knowledge of what he had discovered. Alexander's first instinct was to confront his father, King Edward, with the evidence of the decades-long deception. But as he considered this approach, he realized the complexity of the situation made such a direct confrontation dangerous for everyone involved. King Edward might be completely innocent of any knowledge about Alexander's true parentage, having accepted the official story about his nephew's tragic orphaning just like everyone else. Alternatively, the king might have been complicit in the cover-up from the beginning, making him either a co-conspirator or another victim of the royal family's willingness to sacrifice truth for stability. Instead, Alexander decided to begin his investigation closer to home, with the people who would have been most likely to know about the deception. Lord Chancellor William Ashford had served the royal household for over 30 years, beginning his career during the exact period when Alexander's birth and the subsequent cover story would have been orchestrated. If anyone in the current palace establishment knew the truth about Alexander's parentage, it would be Ashford. The Lord Chancellor was a formidable man in his 70s, with silver hair and a bearing that commanded respect from everyone who encountered him. He had guided the royal family through numerous crises over the decades, from political scandals to personal tragedies, always maintaining the dignity and stability of the monarchy while protecting the family from public scrutiny. Alexander had always respected Ashford's judgment and relied on his counsel, but now he wondered whether that relationship had been built on yet another layer of deception. Alexander requested a private meeting with Lord Ashford, claiming he needed to discuss some sensitive matters related to his grandmother's estate. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening in Ashford's private office, a wood-paneled room lined with legal texts and historical documents that had witnessed countless important decisions affecting the future of the crown. As Alexander prepared for the conversation, he carefully considered his strategy, knowing that he needed to be both clever and cautious in how he approached such dangerous territory. When the evening arrived, Alexander found himself seated across from Lord Ashford with a leather portfolio containing copies of some of the most damning documents he had discovered in his grandmother's secret compartment. The Lord Chancellor appeared relaxed and attentive, clearly expecting nothing more than a routine discussion about administrative matters. Alexander began carefully, explaining that he had been going through his grandmother's personal effects and had found some items that raised questions about family history. Alexander's initial approach was indirect, mentioning that he had discovered some old photographs and correspondence that suggested his grandmother had maintained friendships that hadn't been widely known within the family. He watched Lord Ashford's face carefully for any sign of recognition or concern, but the older man's expression remained professionally neutral. However, when Alexander mentioned finding letters from someone named James Whitmore, he noticed a slight tightening around Ashford's eyes that suggested the name was not unfamiliar. The Lord Chancellor's response was measured and careful. He acknowledged that many members of the royal family maintained correspondence with people from various walks of life, and that such relationships were often kept private to protect both the royals and their friends from unwanted public attention. His explanation was reasonable and diplomatic, but Alexander detected an underlying tension that suggested there was more to the story than Ashford was revealing. Alexander decided to press further, revealing that he had found documentation suggesting that James Whitmore had been more than just a family friend. He produced one of the more personal letters, watching as Lord Ashford's composure began to crack slightly when he recognized the handwriting and the intimate tone of the correspondence. The moment of recognition was brief but unmistakable, confirming that Ashford was indeed familiar with the secret relationship that the letters documented. The confrontation escalated when Alexander revealed that he had actually met with James Whitmore and learned about the cover story that had been constructed around his own birth. Lord Ashford's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The professional mask slipped away, replaced by an expression of shock and what appeared to be genuine fear. For several long moments, the Lord Chancellor said nothing, clearly calculating the implications of Alexander's discovery and trying to determine how much damage had already been done. When Lord Ashford finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been dreading this conversation for decades. He confirmed that Alexander's suspicions were correct, admitting that he had been one of the principal architects of the deception that had hidden Alexander's true parentage from the world. The cover story about the tragic automobile accident, the false documentation of Alexander's lineage, the careful management of all the details that had made the fiction seem credible, all of it had been orchestrated by a small group of palace officials working under the direct authority of Queen Mother Margaret herself. According to Lord Ashford, the decision to create the elaborate deception had been driven by genuine concern for the survival of the monarchy. The sudden death of King Edward's brother, who had been the heir apparent, had left the royal family without a clear line of succession. Queen Mother Margaret's pregnancy had presented an opportunity to solve this crisis, but only if the circumstances of the child's birth could be concealed from public scrutiny. The alternative would have been a constitutional crisis that could have led to the abolition of the monarchy entirely. Lord Ashford explained that the deception had required the cooperation of numerous government officials, including members of the intelligence services who had expertise in creating false identities and documentation. The operation had been treated with the same level of secrecy and professionalism as a matter of national security, because in many ways, that's exactly what it had been. The stability of the British government and its relationship with the Commonwealth had depended on maintaining the fiction of an unbroken royal bloodline. The Lord Chancellor's revelation of the scope of the conspiracy was both illuminating and terrifying. Alexander learned that his entire life had been monitored and managed by people who knew the truth about his origins, but were sworn to secrecy. His education, his relationships, his public appearances, all of it had been carefully orchestrated to maintain the illusion that he was the legitimate heir to the throne. Even some of his closest advisors and friends were part of the conspiracy, though many of them had been told only as much as they needed to know to play their assigned roles. As the conversation continued, Alexander began to understand the tremendous pressure that had been placed on everyone involved in maintaining the secret. Lord Ashford spoke about the weight of carrying such knowledge for decades, knowing that any mistake or indiscretion could destroy not only the monarchy, but the lives of everyone who had participated in the deception. The stress had taken its toll on many of the conspirators, including Queen Mother Margaret herself, who had lived with the constant fear that the truth would eventually be discovered. The Lord Chancellor also revealed that there had been several close calls over the years, moments when investigative journalists or political opponents had come uncomfortably close to uncovering aspects of the truth. Each time, the palace's security apparatus had successfully deflected suspicion or discredited potential threats, but the incidents had served as reminders of how precarious their situation really was. The secret had been preserved not just through careful planning but through constant vigilance and occasional ruthless action to protect it. Alexander found himself grappling with conflicting emotions as he listened to Lord Ashford's confession. On one hand, he felt betrayed and manipulated by the people he had trusted most, angry that his entire identity had been built on lies and deception. On the other hand, he began to understand the impossible position that his grandmother and her allies had been placed in, forced to choose between personal honesty and the stability of an institution that millions of people depended upon for their sense of national identity. The conversation took on an even more urgent tone when Lord Ashford revealed that Alexander was not the only person who knew about the deception. There were still several people alive who had been involved in the original conspiracy, including some who might not be as committed to maintaining the secret as they had been in the past. Additionally, there were documents and evidence beyond what Alexander had discovered, stored in various secure locations as insurance policies or potential blackmail material. Lord Ashford warned Alexander that his investigation and his meeting with James Whitmore had almost certainly been noticed by the security services who continued to monitor anything related to the royal family's protected secrets. There were protocols in place for dealing with threats to national security, and Alexander's actions might have inadvertently triggered responses that could put him and everyone he had contacted in danger. The machinery of state security that had protected the secret for decades could just as easily be turned against those who threatened to expose it. The weight of these revelations pressed down on Alexander like a physical force. He realized that his decision to investigate his grandmother's secret compartment had set in motion a chain of events that could no longer be controlled or contained. The truth about his parentage was now known to multiple people, creating a situation where the secret could no longer be guaranteed to remain hidden. The question was no longer whether the deception would be exposed, but when and how it would happen. As the meeting with Lord Ashford concluded, Alexander understood that he was facing the most difficult decision of his life. He could attempt to maintain the status quo, working with the existing conspiracy to ensure that the secret remained hidden and that the monarchy continued to function as it always had. Alternatively, he could choose to reveal the truth, accepting the consequences for himself and for the institution he had been raised to protect, but, finally, living authentically instead of perpetuating a lie that had defined his existence. The Lord Chancellor's final words to Alexander were both a warning and a plea. He reminded the prince that the decision he made would affect not only his own life, but the lives of millions of people who depended on the stability and continuity of the monarchy. The truth might set Alexander free, but it would also destroy an institution that had provided stability and identity to the nation for over 1,000 years. The choice between personal authenticity and public responsibility had never been more stark or more consequential. As Alexander left Lord Ashford's office and walked through the quiet corridors of Aldermere Palace, he felt the full weight of his impossible situation. The palace that had been his home for his entire life now felt like a prison built from lies and maintained through deception. Every portrait on the walls, every symbol of royal authority, every tradition that he had been raised to honor and preserve, all of it was based on a fundamental falsehood about his own identity and his right to inherit the crown. The young man who had entered Lord Ashford's office believing he was struggling with a personal crisis emerged understanding that he was at the center of a potential constitutional catastrophe. The choices he made in the coming days would determine not only his own future, but the future of the monarchy itself. And there was no clear path forward that would preserve both his integrity and the institution he had been raised to serve. The days following Alexander's confrontation with Lord Ashford were marked by a paralyzing sense of isolation and mounting pressure. The prince found himself questioning every relationship, every conversation, and every moment of his life as he tried to determine who else might be part of the elaborate conspiracy that had shaped his existence. Sleep became elusive as his mind raced through the implications of his discovery, and the familiar routines of royal life felt increasingly hollow and performative. Alexander's attempts to maintain his normal schedule were complicated by the watchful eyes of palace staff and security personnel who seemed to be paying unusual attention to his movements and behavior. Whether this was his imagination, heightened by paranoia and stress, or whether Lord Ashford had indeed alerted others to his discovery, Alexander couldn't be certain. The uncertainty added another layer of anxiety to an already overwhelming situation, making him feel like a prisoner in his own home. The pressure intensified when Alexander received an unexpected phone call from James Whitmore, who reported that he had been contacted by someone claiming to be a journalist investigating historical connections between the royal family and diplomatic personnel from the Cold War era. The caller had specifically mentioned James's service in Brussels and had asked detailed questions about his social connections during that period. While James had refused to provide any information, the incident suggested that word of Alexander's investigation was beginning to spread beyond the small circle of people who already knew the truth. This development forced Alexander to confront the reality that his secret was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. Each day that passed without a decision brought new risks and new complications. The journalist's inquiry might be the first of many such contacts, and if professional investigators began looking seriously into the historical record, they would likely uncover inconsistencies and contradictions that could lead them to the truth. The careful web of deception that had protected the royal family for decades was beginning to unravel, and Alexander was running out of time to control how that process would unfold. Alexander's sense of urgency was further heightened when he learned that King Edward had requested a private audience with him to discuss important family matters. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon, and Alexander spent hours agonizing over whether his father was summoning him because he had learned about the investigation or because of some unrelated royal business. The ambiguity was torture, and Alexander found himself preparing for either possibility while hoping desperately that he would have more time to decide how to handle the explosive knowledge he possessed. The meeting with King Edward took place in the monarch's private study, a comfortable room that had served as the setting for countless important family discussions over the years. Alexander had always felt at ease in this space, surrounded by photographs of family members and mementos from his father's long reign. But now the familiar environment felt charged with tension and potential danger, every object seeming to mock the fraudulent nature of his relationship with the man he had always believed to be his uncle but who had raised him as a son. King Edward appeared relaxed and genuinely pleased to see Alexander, which initially seemed to support the hope that this was indeed just a routine family conversation. The king began by asking about Alexander's work in sorting through Queen Mother Margaret's belongings, expressing his own sadness at the loss of his mother and his appreciation for Alexander's willingness to handle such a difficult task. For several minutes, their conversation followed familiar patterns, touching on family memories and shared experiences that had shaped both their lives. However, Alexander noticed subtle changes in his father's demeanor as the conversation progressed. There were moments of hesitation, careful phrasings of certain topics, and what appeared to be a growing tension beneath the king's calm exterior. When King Edward began asking more specific questions about what Alexander had found among his grandmother's papers, it became clear that this was not the casual conversation it had initially appeared to be. The moment of truth came when King Edward directly asked whether Alexander had discovered anything unusual or unexpected in his grandmother's private effects. The question was posed casually, but the intensity in the king's eyes made it clear that he was seeking specific information. Alexander found himself at a crossroads, forced to decide in that instant whether to continue the deception or to reveal what he had learned about his true parentage. Alexander chose honesty, though he approached the revelation carefully and gradually. He began by mentioning the hidden compartment he had discovered and the documents it contained, watching his father's reaction closely for any sign of surprise or recognition. King Edward listened without interruption, but Alexander could see the subtle changes in his posture and expression that suggested this information was not entirely unexpected. When Alexander revealed that he had met with James Whitmore and learned about the deception surrounding his birth, King Edward's composure finally cracked. The king's face went pale, his hands began to tremble slightly, and for several long moments he seemed unable to speak. When he finally found his voice, it was to ask a question that revealed the depth of his own pain and confusion. "How long have you known?" The conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest and emotional that Alexander had ever shared with the man he had always considered his father. King Edward revealed that he had indeed known the truth about Alexander's parentage from the very beginning, having been brought into the conspiracy by Queen Mother Margaret when she realized that concealing the deception would require the cooperation of the reigning monarch. The burden of this knowledge had weighed heavily on King Edward throughout Alexander's life, creating a complex mixture of love, guilt, and fear that had influenced every aspect of their relationship. According to King Edward, the decision to participate in the cover-up had been one of the most difficult of his entire reign. His genuine love for Alexander as a nephew had made it easy to accept him as a son and heir, but the knowledge that their relationship was built on deception had created a constant source of anxiety and moral conflict. The king had often wondered whether Alexander would ever discover the truth and how such a revelation might affect both their personal relationship and the stability of the monarchy. King Edward explained that the pressure to maintain the secret had influenced many of his decisions regarding Alexander's upbringing and preparation for future royal duties. Every public appearance, every educational choice, every relationship had been evaluated not only for its appropriateness for a future monarch, but also for its potential to expose the hidden truth about Alexander's origins. The constant vigilance required to protect the secret had made normal family relationships nearly impossible, creating distance and formality where there should have been warmth and spontaneity. The king also revealed the existence of contingency plans that had been developed to deal with various scenarios in which the truth might be discovered or threatened with exposure. These plans included everything from media strategies designed to minimize damage to legal frameworks that could potentially legitimize Alexander's position even if his illegitimate birth became public knowledge. The sophistication and comprehensiveness of these preparations spoke to the seriousness with which the royal establishment had regarded the threat posed by the secret. As their conversation continued, Alexander began to understand the profound psychological toll that maintaining the deception had taken on King Edward. The king spoke about nights spent lying awake, wondering whether he was doing the right thing for Alexander, for the monarchy, and for the nation. He described the guilt he felt about denying Alexander the opportunity to know his biological father and the fear that the truth would eventually emerge in a way that would destroy everything they had built together. King Edward also revealed his deep respect and affection for James Whitmore, whom he had met on several occasions during the early years of the deception. The king described James as a man of exceptional character who had made enormous sacrifices for the good of the monarchy, accepting exile from his son's life without bitterness or demands for recognition. The tragedy of the situation was compounded by the fact that all three men, Alexander, King Edward, and James, had been victims of circumstances beyond their control, forced into roles that required them to sacrifice personal happiness for public duty. The emotional weight of these revelations created a bond between Alexander and King Edward that was deeper and more honest than anything they had shared before. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt that he was seeing his father as a complete person rather than just a monarch, understanding the human costs of the choices that had been made in the name of duty and stability. Similarly, King Edward appeared relieved to finally be able to speak openly about the burden he had carried for so many years, even though the conversation forced him to confront the possibility that their family's carefully constructed world was about to collapse. However, the emotional catharsis of their honest conversation could not eliminate the practical problems that Alexander's discovery had created. King Edward made it clear that the situation had moved beyond the point where it could simply be contained within the royal family. The journalist's inquiry to James Whitmore, combined with Alexander's investigation and the various meetings that had taken place, had created a trail of evidence that professional investigators would eventually be able to follow. The question was no longer whether the secret would be exposed, but how quickly that exposure would occur and whether the royal family could control the narrative when it happened. King Edward presented Alexander with three potential paths forward, each carrying significant risks and uncertain outcomes. The first option was to immediately take proactive steps to reveal the truth themselves, controlling the timing and presentation of the information to minimize damage to the monarchy. This approach would require careful coordination with government officials, legal experts, and media specialists to ensure that the revelation was handled in a way that preserved as much stability as possible. The second option was to attempt an even more elaborate cover-up, using the full resources of the state to discredit potential threats and reinforce the official story of Alexander's origins. This approach would require significant government cooperation and would involve tactics that might be morally questionable, but it offered the possibility of preserving the status quo if it could be executed successfully. The third option was for Alexander to voluntarily abdicate his position as heir to the throne, removing himself from the line of succession before the truth about his parentage could become public knowledge. This would protect the monarchy from the constitutional crisis that his illegitimate birth might trigger, but it would also mean abandoning everything he had been raised to accomplish and leaving the succession in the hands of more distant relatives who might not be prepared for the responsibility. Each of these options carried profound implications not only for Alexander and the royal family, but for the British government and the millions of people who looked to the monarchy for stability and continuity. The decision would need to be made quickly before events moved beyond their control, but the consequences would reverberate for generations. Alexander found himself at the center of a historical moment that would define not only his own legacy, but the future of the institution he had been raised to serve. As the meeting with King Edward concluded, Alexander understood that he had reached the point of no return. The comfortable life he had known as crown prince, built on the foundation of carefully maintained lies, was ending regardless of what choice he made. The only question was whether he would play an active role in shaping what came next or whether he would allow events to unfold without his input. The weight of this decision pressed down on him like a physical force, but for the first time since discovering his grandmother's secret, Alexander felt a sense of clarity about what he needed to do. The 48 hours that followed Alexander's conversation with King Edward were marked by frantic activity behind the scenes at Aldermere Palace. Government officials, legal experts, and senior members of the royal household worked around the clock to develop comprehensive strategies for each of the three options that had been presented to Alexander. The urgency of their efforts was driven by intelligence reports suggesting that the journalist who had contacted James Whitmore was not working alone, but was part of a larger investigation that could make the royal family's carefully guarded secret public knowledge within a matter of days. Alexander spent those crucial hours in a state of profound reflection, walking the grounds of Aldermere Palace, and considering not only the immediate implications of his decision, but the broader questions of duty, truth, and personal integrity that his discovery had raised. The weight of potentially ending a 1,000-year-old monarchy was almost unbearable, but equally unbearable was the prospect of continuing to live a lie that grew more elaborate and more morally questionable with each passing year. The prince found himself drawn repeatedly to the garden where his grandmother had spent countless hours during her later years, tending to roses and writing in the journals that had contained so many of her secrets. It was here that Alexander finally reached the decision that would determine not only his own future, but the future of the British monarchy. Standing among the flowers that Queen Mother Margaret had nurtured with such care, Alexander realized that the courage to tell the truth was perhaps the greatest gift he could give to both her memory and to the institution she had sacrificed so much to protect. Alexander's decision was influenced by a conversation he had with James Whitmore on the second evening of his deliberations. The older man had driven to Aldermere Palace at Alexander's invitation, entering the royal residence openly for the first time in over 40 years. The meeting took place in the same study where Alexander had first discovered the hidden compartment, bringing a sense of completion to the circle of events that had begun with his grandmother's secret cache of documents. James brought with him additional materials that he had kept hidden in his own home for decades, including copies of official documents that prove the extent of the government's involvement in creating and maintaining the fiction of Alexander's origins. More importantly, he brought the perspective of someone who had lived with the consequences of the deception for an entire lifetime, watching his son grow up from a distance and accepting the painful reality that duty to the crown required the sacrifice of personal happiness. During their conversation, James revealed his own evolution in thinking about the secret they had all been forced to maintain. In the early years, he had believed that the deception was necessary and justified, protecting both the monarchy and Alexander from the chaos that would have resulted from the truth. But, as the decades passed, and the lies became more elaborate, James had begun to question whether the price of maintaining the secret was becoming too high for everyone involved. James told Alexander about the psychological toll that living with such a profound deception had taken on him personally. The constant fear of discovery, the inability to form genuine relationships due to the secrets he was forced to keep, and the pain of watching his son's public life while being unable to offer guidance or support had created a kind of emotional prison that had defined his existence for more than 40 years. He had come to believe that the truth, however painful its immediate consequences, would ultimately be more liberating than the continued maintenance of an increasingly fragile lie. The older man's perspective helped Alexander understand that his decision would affect not only the monarchy and the nation, but also the real people whose lives had been shaped by the deception. James had spent decades paying the price for a choice that had been made for him by others, and continuing the cover-up would mean asking him to continue that sacrifice indefinitely. Similarly, King Edward and Lord Ashford had borne the burden of complicity in a lie that had grown heavier with each passing year, and the psychological costs of maintaining their silence were becoming increasingly evident. Alexander's final decision crystallized during a private moment in his grandmother's study, as he stood holding the key that had unlocked so many secrets, and considering the legacy he wanted to leave for future generations. He realized that the choice between personal authenticity and institutional stability was a false dilemma, based on the assumption that the monarchy could only survive if it was built on deception. Instead, he began to see the possibility that revealing the truth could actually strengthen the institution by demonstrating its ability to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its core values and purposes. On the third morning after his conversation with King Edward, Alexander requested an immediate meeting with the Prime Minister, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the senior leadership of both Houses of Parliament. The unprecedented nature of the request, combined with the urgency with which it was made, sent shockwaves through the British political establishment. Within hours, speculation was running rampant about what constitutional crisis or family emergency could require such a high-level gathering on such short notice. The meeting took place in a secure conference room at Downing Street, with additional participants joining by encrypted video connection from various locations around the country. Alexander had prepared extensively for this moment, working with constitutional scholars and legal experts to understand the full implications of his revelation and to develop a framework for managing the transition that would follow. The presentation he made to the assembled leadership was comprehensive, honest, and focused on solutions rather than simply problems. Alexander began by revealing the truth about his parentage, presenting the documentary evidence that supported his claims, and explaining how he had discovered the deception that had been maintained for over 4 decades. The initial reaction from the assembled officials was shock and disbelief, followed quickly by urgent questions about the implications for the constitutional order and the stability of the government. Several participants needed time to process the magnitude of what they were hearing before they could begin to engage constructively with the practical challenges that the revelation created. The prince's proposal for managing the crisis was both bold and carefully considered. Rather than attempting to maintain the deception or quietly removing himself from the line of succession, Alexander proposed a public revelation of the truth combined with comprehensive constitutional reforms that would modernize the monarchy for the 21st century. His plan included changes to succession laws that would legitimize his position regardless of the circumstances of his birth, reforms to the relationship between the monarchy and the government that would increase transparency and accountability, and initiatives designed to demonstrate the royal family's commitment to honesty and public service. Alexander argued that the revelation of his true parentage, handled properly, could become an opportunity to strengthen rather than weaken the monarchy by showing that it was capable of evolving and adapting to contemporary values and expectations. The alternative, attempting to maintain an increasingly fragile deception, would only delay the inevitable crisis while creating even greater risks of exposure in circumstances that the royal family could not control. The response from the political and religious leadership was mixed, but generally more supportive than Alexander had dared to hope. The Prime Minister expressed serious concerns about the short-term political implications of such a revelation, but acknowledged that the alternative of attempting to maintain the cover-up indefinitely was probably not viable given the evidence of growing external interest in the story. The Archbishop of Canterbury focused on the moral and ethical dimensions of the situation, expressing appreciation for Alexander's commitment to honesty while acknowledging the complex theological questions raised by legitimizing a monarch whose claim to the throne was not based on traditional bloodline succession. The parliamentary leaders were primarily concerned with the constitutional mechanisms that would be required to implement Alexander's proposed reforms. The changes he was suggesting would require legislation that touched on some of the most fundamental aspects of British governance, including the relationship between the monarchy and Parliament, the role of the Church of England in constitutional matters, and the legal frameworks that govern succession to the throne. The complexity of these changes meant that implementation would take considerable time and would require unprecedented levels of cooperation between different branches of government. Over the following weeks, a carefully orchestrated process of constitutional reform began to take shape. Teams of legal scholars, constitutional experts, and political advisors worked to draft the legislation that would be necessary to legitimize Alexander's position and implement the broader reforms he had proposed. Public relations specialists developed strategies for revealing the truth about Alexander's parentage in a way that would minimize shock and emphasize the positive aspects of the royal family's commitment to transparency and modernization. The revelation itself was handled through a carefully planned series of announcements and public appearances designed to control the narrative and demonstrate the royal family's unity in the face of the constitutional changes. Alexander's first public statement about his true parentage was made during a televised address to the nation, in which he explained the historical circumstances that had led to the deception and outlined his vision for a modernized monarchy that would serve the British people more effectively in the contemporary world. The public reaction to Alexander's revelation was complex and varied, reflecting the deep emotional connections that many people felt to the monarchy and their conflicting feelings about the deception that had been maintained for so many years. Initial polls showed significant confusion and concern about the implications of the prince's illegitimate birth, but these concerns were gradually offset by appreciation for his honesty and his commitment to comprehensive reform of the royal institution. James Whitmore's role in the story was handled with particular sensitivity, as the royal family worked to honor his decades of sacrifice while respecting his privacy and his desire to remain largely out of the public eye. A private ceremony was held to officially recognize his relationship to Alexander, and provisions were made for him to play a more active role in his son's life going forward, though he chose to maintain his quiet retirement rather than taking on any official duties or public responsibilities. The constitutional reforms that Alexander had proposed were implemented gradually over the course of several years, with each change being carefully debated and refined through the democratic process. The legislation that legitimized his position as heir to the throne was passed with overwhelming support from both houses of Parliament, reflecting a broad consensus that the prince's honesty and commitment to reform had earned him the right to continue in his role despite the irregular circumstances of his birth. The broader reforms to the monarchy proved more challenging to implement, requiring extensive negotiations between different stakeholders and careful attention to the complex relationships between traditional institutions and contemporary democratic values. However, the process of reform itself became a source of renewed public interest in and support for the monarchy, as people appreciated the royal family's willingness to evolve and adapt to changing expectations rather than simply defending outdated traditions. Alexander's decision to reveal the truth about his parentage ultimately transformed not only his own life, but the entire relationship between the British monarchy and the people it served. The courage to confront a decades-old deception and to choose transparency over the easier path of continued secrecy established a new standard for royal leadership that emphasized integrity, accountability, and genuine service to the public good. The constitutional crisis that many had feared never materialized, as the British people proved to be more interested in authentic leadership than in the preservation of comfortable fictions. The story of Alexander's discovery and his response to it became a defining moment in the modern history of the British monarchy, demonstrating that even the most traditional institutions could find new relevance and strength through honest engagement with contemporary values and expectations. The prince who had begun his journey believing he was the product of a noble bloodline ended it as a leader who had earned his position through character and conviction rather than accident of birth, creating a legacy that would influence the monarchy for generations to come.